3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. Today I'm going to be talking about the history of confirmation bias. So essentially, since our species has existed, one of our greatest flaws has been our desire to seek out what confirms what we already believe to be true, instead of seeking out what is actually true based on the best evidence available. Because if you believe in something bad enough, your perception of the world will be shaped by that belief, regardless of reality. And this is called confirmation bias. And we as human beings do this consistently throughout our lives because at the end of the day, no one wants their beliefs to be challenged, nor do they want to be proved wrong. It's kind of a protection mechanism because we get comfort by creating this fictitious reality. And thus, when met with opposition, we can easily get upset because we want what we believe to be considered a scientific fact. However, we all know this isn't how the world works. As people, we debate things all the time, whether it's with friends, family, or even complete strangers, about what should be considered truth in this world. Unfortunately, though, the whole idea of debate often just leads to unnecessary arguing because it's not really a conversation between two open-minded individuals, but rather just two people competing to make each other's point of views look bad. And that's not really how we improve anything. So debates in many ways are not very useful unless you're trying to change the mind of an audience instead of the person you are debating. Anyway, historically, there are many examples of confirmation bias. For example, for thousands of years, various religious beliefs have existed in human societies all over the world. And of course, each society with a different religious beliefs believes with absolute certainty that their religion is the correct belief and that other beliefs are wrong. For example, historically, the Roman Empire often persecuted people who held religious beliefs which were not supported by the government. And this concept of some religions being inferior to others is still very prominent today. We see this with extremist religious groups all over the world, where they can be so aggressive towards people that believe in something different that they can commit acts of violence against them. And even on the more subtle level, we see this with missionary groups. For example, if you think about all the Christian missionaries all over the world that seek to convert people of other faiths to Christianity. Now, regardless of one's views on missionary practices, it is clear that the idea behind being a missionary is that you believe that you are doing God's work to save other people who are believing in false religions or no religion at all. So this mentality in general of religious bias is as old as human civilization and remains very much alive today. Another example, though, of confirmation bias goes back to the founding of the United States of America, where since the 1780s, the United States has had political parties, which has given birth to the idea among many party members that their party is always right and the other party is always wrong, which is certainly a concept that remains not only common today, but I would say toxically common today, where people look for anything to confirm their own biased beliefs about why their party is better than the other. And sadly, it is exactly this idea of political polarization based on party politics that the first American president, George Washington, warned about. Because partisan politics, he feared, could tear the country apart. And unfortunately, we're kind of seeing that today. Now, these are only a couple examples of confirmation bias historically, which have haunted human society But now I just want to go through a list of a few modern examples that also reflect confirmation bias. So it's just starting off with a fairly controversial one, is the invasion of Iraq, where the American president George W. Bush started due to bad intelligence information which suggested to him that the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that Iraq had ties to the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, which, based on the experience of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Bush feared could lead to further attacks on the United States using weapons of mass destruction. However, this intelligence information would turn out to be completely wrong. Iraq didn't have neither weapons of mass destruction nor ties to Al-Qaeda. And so we have to ask ourselves, why did President Bush believe this? And the reason is that President Bush desperately wanted to believe this because he truly thought that Saddam Hussein had both. And to Bush's credit, there was certainly plenty of reasons to be concerned about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. Because Saddam Hussein was not only a ruthless dictator, but also someone who in the past did actually have weapons of mass destruction, like chemical and biological weapons. And he also actively tried to get nuclear weapons. Additionally, to make matters worse, Saddam Hussein in the past had plotted to assassinate the former American president George H.W. Bush, who was the father of George W. Bush. So you can see how George W. Bush, based on that history, would be pretty concerned about Saddam Hussein. Anyway, leading up to the invasion, Saddam Hussein pretended that he still had weapons of mass destruction and was preventing necessary inspections led by the United Nations, which were trying to prove concretely that he didn't. And he kept interfering with these, preventing inspectors from really getting a crystal clear picture of what he actually had. And part of this was strategic on Saddam Hussein's part because he believed that this was advantageous and would help him protect his regime. Because if people thought that he had this, he felt that people then, countries like the United States, would never actually invade Iraq because they would fear him. But it also should be pointed out that though Saddam Hussein didn't actually have them, despite trying to make it look like he did, he still wanted to obtain new weapons of mass destruction at some point in time, even if he didn't have them when the invasion of Iraq happened, which he was not expecting. Now, on top of all this, Saddam Hussein was also a sponsor of terrorism, just not Al-Qaeda. So anyway, the United States would eventually invade Iraq based on false information, remove Saddam Hussein from power, which tragically resulted in the deaths of thousands of people who got caught in a war between the Saddam Hussein regime and the United States military. And this really was just kind of a long struggle for the Iraqi people because prior to the U.S. invading, Saddam Hussein did not rule over a peaceful Iraq because Saddam Hussein was killing thousands of his own people, used weapons of mass destruction on his own people. So the Iraqi people really were putting up with a lot. It was a really bad situation. And when the invasion happened, there was more destruction going on. And then the U.S. would try to rebuild, which obviously, as we know, the history was a struggle as well. In general, though, when we think again about the idea of confirmation bias, the Bush administration really presents us with a classic case where George W. Bush and his administration were focused too much on the wrong evidence, which led to this war. And though obviously George W. Bush deserves the most blame for this unnecessary invasion occurring, we also have to keep in mind that this was supported by many politicians in the United States and influential people in the political world. People like Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and more. So this was by no means an unpopular war when it happened. It just became unpopular over time when people started to learn more information about how badly of a screw-up it turned out to be. Now, on the flip side of all this, It's one thing to criticize the Bush administration for being completely wrong about weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda in Iraq. But there are some who decide to take this to a whole new level. People that really, really were ticked off at George Bush, rightfully so, but then also go on to claim things like George Bush is a war criminal and many other things. However, this claim has its own issues with bias as well, because there are many people, because they just are so upset with the Bush administration and its invasion of Iraq, that any negative idea that gets promoted out there in the media space about Bush, they'll automatically believe because they've already pictured him as this evil person doing all these terrible things. And that's the thing with confirmation bias, is that once you hear something that you want to believe, you're much more likely to believe it, especially if it confirms already what you believe. And so many conspiracy theories about the Bush administration have been floated around, which don't have any evidence. For example, that he knowingly lied about Iraq. However, the Bush administration's issues with, as I mentioned before, confirmation bias don't actually qualify as lies. And so you can't really say that the Bush administration knowingly lied to invade Iraq. Nor are other claims correct that Iraq was invaded for oil, which is just another conspiracy theory with no evidence. The U.S. had no need for Iraqi oil. And generally speaking, when it comes to the idea that Bush is a war criminal, we really have to focus on what was Bush's intent. And his intent wasn't, let's lie to invade Iraq. It was, I truly believe that they have weapons of mass destruction, and this is what the intelligence I'm getting, and I really want to believe this intelligence, so I'm going to invade Iraq. And so we have to focus on intent, because intent does not equate to war crimes. Now, other controversies about the invasion of Iraq are about things like, was the invasion of Iraq illegal or not? And technically, this is debatable, because even if it is clear the war never should have happened, whether the United States should have gotten permission from the United Nations to wage this war is debated. And this is because technically nations do have to get United Nations permission to wage a war. However, very few wars historically have ever gotten permission from the United Nations. And in the case of Iraq, Iraq had already violated United Nations resolutions requiring inspections of Iraqi facilities regarding weapons of mass destruction. And thus the Bush administration said, well, if the United Nations isn't going to enforce these inspections of Iraq, and Iraq's just allowed to continuously delay the process, that this represented a national security threat to the U.S., and the Bush administration told the United Nations to enforce these resolutions, which it didn't. And thus the Bush administration then eventually would decide that they would no longer wait and declared an invasion out of self-defense. And after this invasion began, the United Nations would never officially give a resolution supporting or condemning the invasion of Iraq when it was happening. And it wasn't until after it happened in 2004 that the United Nations Secretary General would declare the war to be illegal. And of course, it also should be pointed out that the U.S. wasn't alone when it invaded Iraq. Britain, Australia, Poland, as well as the Kurds in Iraq also took part in the invasion. And the United Nations would even set up operations in Iraq when it was occupied by the U.S. And the U.S. did keep the international community in the loop about what it was doing in Iraq in order to be as transparent as possible. So when we're trying to make sense of all this, it's clear that the United Nations was pretty slow to act on everything, and then later declared that it was illegal just because they didn't know what else to say. Which just shows how many issues the United Nations have, because they failed to force Iraq to comply with the necessary inspections. And then while the invasion was going on, never actually officially condemned or supported it, but rather just gave a statement after the fact. Probably due to the frustration of the situation in Iraq after the invasion. And also we have to point out that this is by far not the only issue the United Nations has. Even today, there are still many nations, for example, on the United Nations Human Rights Council that have many documented human rights issues in their own country. So the United Nations in general is a very flawed organization. And based on the situation and how it played out, that's why it's really debatable whether it was illegal or not, because the United Nations didn't actually declare it illegal until after it was already over. And the invasion only again occurred because the United Nations couldn't actually force Iraq to do anything. And so it was just a complete mess. Now today there are some that will talk about what's happening in Ukraine with Russia, and they'll say, well, the United States invaded Iraq, so why are we acting like Russia's doing anything different? However, that's pretty misleading because it's very different what Russia is doing. Russia's not only invading Ukraine, but it's actively committing genocide in Ukraine. And it's not an invasion to topple a horrendous dictator who, is failing to pass United Nations inspections. Rather, it's just trying to conquer a democracy to make it part of Russia. And this is why the whole reaction by the United Nations is quite a bit different to Russia's situation, where the United Nations has not only condemned Russia's invasion and genocide of Ukraine, but also has kicked Russia off the Human Rights Council, making it clearly illegal, unlike what happened when the U.S. invaded Iraq. Additionally, Russia has constantly broken United Nations rules over and over again publicly and has shown no remorse for it. So comparing that and the invasion of Iraq, though the invasion of Iraq should not have happened, comparing those two really is just pseudo-historical. Now, the last controversy I want to mention about the Bush administration, because certainly they were pretty controversial, is the treatment of terrorists and suspected terrorists. This is another reason why some people may call Bush a war criminal, because Bush never got in trouble for things like the torture of prisoners. Now, the reason being for that, whether right or wrong, is because these prisoners were held outside of American territory at Guantanamo Bay. And because these people were suspected terrorists or actual terrorists, they don't count as lawful enemy combatants. So thus, despite there being many serious ethical issues with what the Bush administration did, he technically did not break any rules. Because terrorists and suspected terrorists do not get the same rights as lawful enemy combatants. Now, another super controversial belief today is the Second Amendment. And this is due to the Supreme Court rulings in 2008 and 2010, which decided in multiple 5-4 opinions that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own guns for self-defense. Now, why this is historically controversial is that it overturned 2 centuries of scholarly consensus on the issue, because this was not how the Second Amendment was interpreted historically. Now, as a result of these opinions, today there are many Americans who have become staunch supporters of gun rights to the point where it's almost like a religious cult, where people almost worship the concept of having guns. However, despite the Supreme Court's ruling and its effect on the laws of the United States, when we examine the history of the Second Amendment and its interpretation of the United States, it's really quite clear that this ruling was based on politics rather than historical accuracy. In fact, historians know what the Founding Fathers meant by the creation of the Second Amendment, and it certainly wasn't about the right of individuals to own guns for self-defense. Instead, it was about the right of states to have their own regulated militias for self-defense against a tyrannical government, because it was created after the American Revolution. And the American experiences with the British monarchy made states worried about a future tyrannical federal government. Unfortunately, though, many have chosen to take the Second Amendment out of its historical context and ignore the whole first part of the amendment, which talks about a well-regulated militia. And this is because people simply just want to believe that the Second Amendment gives them the right to own guns. Thus, many read the Second Amendment in a way that fits with what they want to believe, much like how there are many, very conservative churches in the United States, which will read the Bible out of its historical context and come up with their own random interpretation of what the Bible means in an activity known as Bible thumping. And this is why, of course, you have so many churches that have different interpretations of the Bible and so many different denominations. So with the Second Amendment, that's basically what's going on. There's people that are just taking the Second Amendment and turning it into whatever they want it to be. And I guess that's also one of the ironies about when we hear lots of, really, really big gun supporters that, say they're defending the Constitution by protecting the Second Amendment. Ironically, though, if you're misinterpreting the Constitution, you're not actually defending it, nor the Second Amendment. But just for argument's sake, if we were to assume hypothetically that the Second Amendment actually did protect the individual right to bear arms for self-defense, which there are many who strongly believe this, and if we think logically about this, we have to ask ourselves, would that even make sense, even if the Second Amendment even did mean the right to own guns for self-defense? Because right now in the United States, the country is around the top 30 in terms of the highest rate of death from gun violence in the world. And it's number one in terms of highest rate of gun violence and death from gun violence when it comes to the wealthy nations of the world. So then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what makes the United States different than other nations when it comes to guns? And the answer is that other nations either have banned guns or have more restrictions in place than the U.S. does. Because statistically, nations with stricter gun control laws than the U.S. have far fewer rates of gun violence. Meanwhile, in the U.S., most mass shooters in the last 10 years have actually purchased their guns legally. In fact, in the last 10 years, there are 22 people who committed mass shootings, and most of them use semi-automatic weapons, which are banned in most countries. Now, in response to this, many people who are against banning any types of guns or any further gun restrictions, they will say, oh, we have a mental health crisis, this isn't a gun issue, it's a people issue. And then they'll say this kind of one-liner that, guns don't kill people, people do. And though, it's obvious you like guns and that's your opinion, at the same time, it's obviously illogical given the big picture and what we know about nations with statistically similar mental health disorder rates who still have way less gun violence than the U.S. So it's clearly not an American people problem. And the idea that guns don't kill people is also pretty ridiculous, considering guns were literally invented by people to kill other people. It would be like saying, grenades don't kill people. But we don't have grenades in our homes. We're not allowed to use grenades for self-defense, though you never know if you're going to get if you feel that you need to have a semi-automatic rifle for self-defense because a bunch of people might come after you, why not have grenades? Why not have artillery in your house? But we don't have those things because it's ridiculous. Another kind of funny thing, though, is when people compare guns to cars. And they say that, well, if you're going to ban guns, what are you going to do next? Ban cars? And it's, well, no, we're not going to ban cars next. Because we all know that it's way easier to kill people with guns than it is a car. You could certainly use a car as a weapon. But a car is not spraying bullets from far away. If you're going to hit a bunch of people with a car, you're probably not going to get out of there. Because if you're running a car into a crowd, you're going to be surrounded by other people in that crowd eventually. You're not going to be able to run over everyone. Well, if you have a gun, you can shoot someone from a distance and not be close to people. And in general, when it comes to using guns for self-defense, it almost never happens. It's incredibly rare that you have a situation where someone's actually fought off a person with a gun using a gun for self-defense, or even using a gun in self-defense in general. Most people aren't just sitting there waiting for someone to attack them while they're holding their gun or have a gun strapped to them. It just doesn't happen. Occasionally there'll be a few cases where it does, and people can rally around that case as if that's proof of concept. But generally speaking, it's super rare for such a situation to occur where you're going to literally be fighting off someone. because you have a gun. And in fact, there have been several times during mass shootings where someone did have a gun who could have stopped the shooter, but for whatever reason, they were not able to. So as much as various Americans love to think of themselves as this James Bond-like figure who, is constantly ready to fight off an attacker and save the day like a superhero, the reality is it's mostly just a myth. And unfortunately, gun culture in America is not short of myths. There are plenty of conspiracy theories and just outright delusions about what people think they can do by having guns. Perhaps one of the more comical ones comes from far-right militia groups in the U.S. who, will claim that they could defeat the U.S. military in combat because if the government ever decides to rise up and be tyrannical against the people, that they could stop the tyranny and save the day. We literally have people right now, groups of people who hang out in the forests playing soldier with semi-automatic weapons and preparing for combat just in case the government decides to try to become authoritarian, pretending to be professional soldiers or something. Some of them have actually been professional soldiers, but have fallen victim to this kind of delusional ideology around guns. Ironically, many of these people also, if they were to try to join the U.S. military, would never even make it through basic training because many of them are, not exactly physically fit, nor all that professional. So the fact that they believe they would defeat the most powerful and well-trained and advanced military force in the world is, ultimately it's just dumb. However, what is even more disturbing about these militia groups is not only the fact that they feel they are invincible and can defeat the U.S. military, but they are very susceptible to radical beliefs, which means that the potential for armed far-right militia groups or individuals sympathetic to these groups to commit acts of terrorism due to their conspiratorial worldview is very real. And historically, far-right terrorism has happened in the U.S., and even the recent mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, was based on this far-right ideology. So overall, when it comes to the obsession with gun rights in America, part of it is driven by people who just like to have guns, and they like to go and shoot for fun. And then the other part is due to people who live with this perpetual paranoia where they feel that they may need to defend themselves against some attack at any moment. In fact, there are literally people who wake up every day and will get out of bed and will grab their gun and strap it to their waist, thinking to themselves that they may have to kill someone out of self-defense, which just shows how disturbing the gun culture problem has become in the U.S. And you almost have to feel sorry for people that live with this paranoia, because what type of, who wants to live in a society where they feel they need to have a gun for protection in the first place? Is our society that pathetic that, unlike most countries in the world that have police and government and laws that's able to prevent this need, that people in the United States can't have that? That we have to all go carrying guns everywhere? Now, turning towards another biased idea popular today, on the opposite end of the spectrum, when it comes to far left groups, is the idea of this modern Western imperialism. And this is popular especially among many socialists today in the West, like Noam Chomsky, as well as and outside the West with authoritarian nations like China and North Korea and Russia and Iran. And though it is without a doubt that the U.S. and many European nations have historically engaged in imperialism with things like colonization and conquering foreign, territories, at the same time, many authoritarian nations, and ironically, many nations with socialist histories, also have a very imperialistic past. Obviously, some examples include in the Soviet Union, who committed some of the worst imperialistic crimes in recent memory. And even today, nations with socialist histories like China engages in imperialism over the Uyghur population in China, the Tibetan population, and threatens with imperialism over Taiwan. In Russia, you have imperialism over Chechens and attempted imperialism over Ukrainians and Georgians and Moldovans, people that used to belong to the fringes of the Russian Empire or part of the Soviet Union that Russia still believes is part of their sphere of influence. And generally speaking, throughout human history, stronger nations all over the world have engaged in imperialism. It doesn't matter whether it's an African civilization or one in the Americas or in Asia, the Middle East, or Europe. Everybody has engaged in imperialism at some point in time. That's just how the world was for so long. If you find a weaker group of people, people would just naturally exploit them and try to conquer their land. And though it wasn't good, that's just the way the world has worked for many years. And now we are finally living in an era where we can start calling that out. But if we're just cherry picking and pointing at some societies but not others, then we're not really doing ourselves a favor because we're just being biased. So the idea that this is strictly a Western phenomenon is really just based on propaganda by socialist groups pushing their own political agenda or by authoritarian dictatorships that want to engage in imperialism but don't want to get called out for it. And when it comes to socialist groups, the reason why that they do this is because they want political power. And they want the current democratic governments in Western nations to be replaced by a socialist government. That's their goal. So automatically, due to their own confirmation bias, they're going to be hypercritical of Western democratic capitalist governments and view them negatively. While at the same time, many of these socialist groups will also be very sympathetic to authoritarian nations with socialist histories like Russia and China. Because though they're not democracies, they still have socialist pasts. So to them, they can look at these countries as, well, sure, they have their issues, but hey, they were still socialists. On top of this, claims that the US or Western European nations are still imperialistic today is ultimately just misinformation because they are not. As I mentioned earlier, no one is taking over other nations like Russia is trying to do in Ukraine. And in Iraq, the US had no intentions of taking Iraqi territory. So really what's happening with socialist groups and their criticism of Western democracies fits within the realm of what is called by some as activist history. And activist history has really come about in recent years, especially in the 21st century, where there's a very manipulative version of history that gets promoted that is highly misleading, and it's really just used to promote a political agenda as a replacement of traditional history, which is just based on, okay, what do we know? What's the evidence that we have? Now, continuing with political ideologies that are popular in the West that kind of reject the traditional politics in the West. The concept of isolationism is another that has become popular among groups that suffer from confirmation bias, especially some libertarians, socialists, and Trump supporters. And the idea of isolationism comes from the belief that, your nation should stay out of foreign conflicts. For example, the U.S. should stay out of foreign conflicts when it comes to things like Russia's invasion and genocide against Ukraine. And the idea behind this is that, a society's better off avoiding getting wrapped up in other nations' world affairs and conflicts. However, history has shown us that though it certainly is partly true, you want to avoid getting involved in unnecessary foreign wars and things that could not only make the conflict worse but cause unnecessary problems for your own nation. But we also know that sometimes it is necessary to get involved in foreign conflicts, especially in a globalized world, which these conflicts can have consequences for all of us. Let's not forget that the United States, tried to stay out of World War II until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which would then quickly change the American opinion about the war. And obviously today, we're in a world where Russia is trying to actively conquer Ukraine. That presents a major threat to world stability because you have an authoritarian dictator in Vladimir Putin who, if were to be successful in conquering Ukraine, would then be on the doorstep of many other NATO nations with the confidence that he's able to get away with conquering countries and could then look to conquer more, which would increase the chances of a conflict with NATO. While alternatively, if he fails to conquer Ukraine and the world unites against his attempted conquest, he can't pose a threat to other nations. So isolationism on paper sounds good, but in reality, sooner or later in a globalized world, nations have to react to aggressive nations, especially if it's a nation that is as influential as like Russia or China. If there are minor conflicts in certain countries that really have no impact on the world is one thing. But if once nations start trying to conquer other countries, that becomes a problem. Now, moving on to Russia a bit, there is a very interesting bias in Russia when it comes to historical memory. And that is the false claim promoted in Russia that in World War II, the Soviet Union basically defeated Nazi Germany by themselves. This is obviously nationalistic propaganda that fits into the common narrative in modern Russia that Russia is alone and the West can't be trusted and the West has historically never been trustworthy. And therefore, when people believe already their government's propaganda about how evil the West is and only wants to hurt Russia, people are easily going to accept pseudo-historical claims like, the Soviet Union won World War II by itself, because it feeds into their own biases, especially when it fits into, the anti-Western sentiment, which is constantly being promoted on Russian government television. In reality, of course, though, when it comes to World War II, Britain and the US and several other countries with the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany together. And of course, there is no evidence that any of these nations could have defeated Nazi Germany alone. Thus, the primary allies of the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union were all crucial to defeating the Nazis. So now, before I finish this up, there's one more topic that I want to cover because I think it's a little bit different, but also fits into this idea of confirmation bias. And so shifting gears a bit, the last example I want to give is the rise of digital concepts like NFTs and cryptocurrencies. And these NFTs are basically these little digital pictures that you can buy online where you just buy the digitized picture. And cryptocurrency is obviously an attempt to get rid of the traditional currencies like the dollar and replace them or just have an alternative type of currency you can use. Unfortunately, though, both are unproven in terms of real long-term value and are both really considered to be risky investments that can make you lose lots of money if you're not careful. However, there are still many people who are willing to make these risky investments due to their belief that they can make lots of money doing it, especially when they see lots of celebrities talking about how everyone needs to be doing this because they are. And for people that, look up to these celebrities and trust them and think that, well, if they're doing it, then it must be good, then they should too, where they think to themselves, well, hey, if, this person's doing it, then I should probably do it too because they're smart and I want to be, I want to make money like they are. But the problem is that these celebrities have lots of money to invest. And additionally, some of them are even paid to advertise these digital concepts. So when they're posting on social media about, how, you need to invest your money in this, or they're doing commercials saying, oh, you need to invest your money in this. They're not really thinking about you. They're not thinking about how they can help you make money. Many of them, in fact, are just thinking about how they can make money. Because the more people that invest in these digital concepts, the more these celebrities can financially benefit. So though I'm sure there are celebrities that, really aren't thinking about this as a way of profiting off fans, though there certainly are some that are. Regardless, it is best to be skeptical of what your favorite celebrity tries to advertise to you. And it's best not to have blind faith in those who seek to profit off you. Also, another thing when it comes to cryptocurrencies is that their environmental impact is also not very good. So it takes a lot of energy to run the whole cryptocurrency industry. So just another downside, which, especially in a world that's becoming more energy cautious and trying to be more conservative with energy, that in the foreseeable future could be a problem facing cryptocurrencies. So at the end of the day, when it comes to confirmation bias, it's very easy for our species to fall victim to it. However, if we pay closer attention to the desires that we have and the fact that there are many who seek to take advantage of our biases to get us to blindly support something, if we're aware of this, we can force ourselves to question whether what we're believing actually makes sense, and whether we're believing something because it's actually true and there's evidence for it, or if we're just believing it because we've basically programmed ourselves to believe whatever we hear that supports what we want to believe. And if we can question ourselves and be aware of our biases, then we're much more likely to get accurate information. The easiest thing to do is to live in a fictitious reality where we're always right and what we want to believe is always true. But when you do that, you would only be living a lie. So, as always, remember, billions of years led to you. So make the most of it.